Hello, welcome everybody. I'm Kate Casey, the Faculty Director of the King Center on Global Development. And as you know, it is a big year for elections around the world, so I'm delighted to welcome all of you to our speaker series on lessons for democracy from the Global South. So the King Center is Stanford's multidisciplinary research hub that focuses on issues of global poverty and development. So we sponsor research and we also train the next generation of global thinkers, as well as hosting interesting conversations like this one on critical issues. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this event, Soledad Ortiz Prilaman, who's an assistant professor of political science here at Stanford. She's one of our faculty affiliates, and she's the faculty director of the Inclusive Democracy and Development Lab, which is funded by the King Center. So she is a force of nature and a rising star at the intersection of comparative political economy, development, and gender. And she's got an empirical focus on South Asia. So her research addresses issues like the political consequences of development, political behavior and representation of minority groups with a particular focus on women, and the study of inequalities in political engagement. So I could not think of a better, more expert person to facilitate this conversation. So I'm going to pass it over to Soledad and thank her for being willing to moderate and let her introduce our panelists. Thanks to all of you for joining us. This promises to be a great conversation.
Kate, thank you for that truly incredible introduction. And welcome everyone. I'm thrilled to be here and just truly honored to have the opportunity to moderate this. So the goal of today, as Kate mentioned, is it's been a year for elections, not just in terms of large elections happening, but those elections yielding interesting and important insights. And I am just so honored that we have the panelists here to join us for this conversation. And part of what sparked the aim of this conversation is that we know there's a big election looming in just a couple of months in the US. And even since we decided to have this webinar, there have been major changes in what that election is going to look like. And yet we know that there have also been very large and important elections in other countries, particularly in the global South, that have really sparked a lot of important and new learnings about how democracy is functioning. And so this is really meant to be a dialogue, thinking about how do we learn from across the globe and how do we sort of bring learnings into our understanding and conception of US politics from particularly the global South. And so with that, it is just a true privilege to introduce our speakers. And so I'll share a little bit about the three panelists that we have today and their backgrounds, and then I'll give you all a little bit of an overview of where we're going before I turn it over to our first panelist. So the first person joining us is Jennifer Piscopo, who is a professor of gender and politics at Royal Holloway University of London. Her research, she is a leading expert in the study of women and particularly women's political representation and gender in elections in Latin America. Though she also has worked in the US and around the globe. And Jennifer is going to speak with us today about the remarkable election that happened in Mexico this year and provide her perspective, both as a general scholar of elections in Latin America and in Mexico, but also with a particular sort of background and focus on how identity and gender intersects with those. After Jennifer speaks, we're going to hear from Milan Vaishnav, who is a senior fellow and director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His research focuses on India and the political economy of India. And he also is a core expert in thinking about representation and governance, particularly thinking about corruption and governance, state capacity, electoral behavior, and the diaspora. He has a really important and critical book about representatives and political selection in the Indian context. And he's also the host, for all of you, just to do a plug, of a really important podcast on Indian politics called Grand Tamasha. So I'd encourage you all to look at that. And then after Milan, we're going to hear from Daniel Decat, who is an assistant professor of quantitative research methods at the London School of Economics. His research focuses on South Africa, again, with a focus on democracy, but more generally thinking about decision-making democracy in South African politics. And he is, really one of the leading experts and voices in political science on South African politics and democratic processes. And so he's going to share with us about the election that happened in South Africa this year. And so with all of that said, the run of show is going to be that I'm going to turn it to each of these panelists to give a short 5 to 10 minute presentation on their interpretation, their understanding, a quick overview of the elections that they are experts on, as well as some general or initial thoughts on how we might think of the learnings from those elections and how they would apply to the US context. After that, I will moderate a Q&A. I'll start with a couple of questions internally for the panelists that will go round robin, have each of them answer. But then I'd really like to leave quite a bit of time at the end for your questions. And so I'd encourage you all throughout this presentation to add your questions to the Q&A box, as well as if you see other questions that you would like answered, you can upvote those questions. And so we'll be looking at which questions are the most exciting to everyone and try to get to as many of those as possible before the end of the hour. And so before I turn it over to Jennifer to get us started with thinking about what we can learn from Mexico, I really just want to sort of give one more thanks to the panelists for being here and for sharing their expertise with all of us at the King Center. And so with that, I'm going to turn over to Jennifer.
Great. Thank you so much, Soleil and the team for inviting me to speak. I'm really excited to be here today. And so I'm going to give some quick background and talking points on the Mexican elections, which were held on June 2nd. Mexican presidents, this was a presidential and congressional and local elections, but thinking about the presidential race, Mexican presidents are elected for 6-year terms and they cannot stand for re-election. So the outgoing president was this gentleman you see here, Andrés Manuel López Obrador. He's known by his initials AMLO. He was elected in 2018 and so serving this 6-year term with the party called Morena, which is his sort of personal vehicle that he created to position himself for the presidency, which he ultimately attained. So AMLO is a complicated and polemical figure in Mexico, as many of the folks on this call know. In broad terms, he is on the left and he represents a strand of Latin American left populism. He has positioned himself and continues to position himself as a champion of Mexicans poor. His term is marked by heavy amounts of social investment, social welfare spending for poor, disenfranchised, marginalized populations in urban and rural areas. And this has really bolstered the support for his party. And it's important to realize that these really are populations that previously had been neglected under previous Mexican presidents. Another way that he has earned his populist moniker is as president, he has taken steps that many view, rightly so, as anti-democratic. He's pursued ambitious electoral and political reforms, some of which try to diminish the extent of open political competition in Mexico. He attempted and had to settle for a more reduced effort to hobble Mexico's National Electoral Institute, which until that moment was sort of widely recognized for its ability to run technically robust elections, and it was sort of a hallmark for Mexico and in the world for how emerging democracies can run clean elections. So AMLO's been a very political figure. The standard bearer in his party, who is now the president-elect, right, who won handily, was handpicked by AMLO to succeed him, although she did best her 2 male rivals in a party primary that, depending on where you sit, was more or less open. But she is Claudia Sheinbaum, and she is the former governor of Mexico City. Her opponent in the race was Xochitl Galvez, who was a former senator and the former head of the Bureau of Indigenous Affairs under then President Vicente Fox. She was the candidate put forward by the Opposition Alliance, which brought together the traditional parties of the left, the center, and the right, united in their opposition to AMLO and the Morena project. And so this set up an extremely interesting dynamic that caught a lot of global attention. These two candidates between themselves for the entire race were polling over 90% of the vote. So it was clear that this was an all-women race and Mexico was poised to elect its first woman president, no matter who won. And I can talk a little bit more in the Q&A about the dynamics of this all-women race. But I will just say, that both of these women were deeply experienced politicians, no matter what anyone thought of their policy proposals. And Xochitl was always playing from behind, given the extraordinary popularity of Morena, and given, of course, that the strange bedfellows of this opposition alliance meant that there was not the kind of backing for her to run from the party that Sheinbaum received from a very unified, very popular incumbent party. So that's the scenario in the election. And next slide, please. So the burning question, because Sheinbaum was first the presumptive nominee, and then throughout the race, the presumptive winner, given her excellent poll performance over Xochitl and all of the early polls, and then in the final result. So everyone's burning question, because Sheinbaum was seen as AMLO's protege, is she going to be her own person? Or will she continue the kinds of programs that AMLO has promoted that have been very popular within Mexico, but also very criticized within Mexico and very criticized in the global community? This question has a bit of a gendered taint to it, of course, this idea that women cannot be their own person in politics. But I will say that most people acknowledge that Sheinbaum, she has a doctorate in climate science. She was a climate scientist before she entered politics. They did recognize that she was a learned and storied politician in her own right. But this question was also a bit misleading, because she is running as the candidate for the popular incumbent party. She needs AMLO's endorsement. She needs his support to win. Her ability, of course, to outright contradict his vision for the country during the campaign might not have been a very strong campaign move, as we can see in the next slide, please. Because not only did Sheinbaum win, but Morena won in a landslide in the Congress. The final votes are still being counted, but they have attained a supermajority in the lower house and are likely to have a supermajority in the Senate, which matters because a supermajority is needed for constitutional reforms. So the voters spoke, and the voters spoke very clearly. One thing actually that the polls did slightly get wrong was Morena emerging with a legislative supermajority. I talked to a lot of reporters in the weeks before the election. This is why we shouldn't do this. They asked me, is Claudia going to be her own person? I said, well, she's probably not going to get a congressional majority. So this is going to complicate the scenario no matter what. Well, not only did she get the congressional majority, she got a super majority. And I think that's because the kinds of voters that clearly turn out and support Morena, being voters who are traditionally outside of the attention of Mexican politicians, again, urban and rural poor, were probably not in the polling frame, right? But this legislative majority is not necessarily a pure blessing, right? There's been a clear mandate for Morena and Morena's policies to continue. Sheinbaum is now the president-elect. If she were to pursue her own path on any policies, she could be starting to spend a high level of political capital that she has right now. And why would she start to do that necessarily? There are going to be many legislators in Congress who are Morenistas, who are going to be deeply loyal to AMLO, who are going to want to see AMLO's reforms continue, and she is going to have to manage this enormous coalition. So people are trying to read the tea leaves on this question of whether or not she's her own person, and you can read these tea leaves, in my view, in either way. On the one hand, some of her ministerial appointments suggest continuity with the AMLO legacy, especially relative to finance and social spending. She's elected to retain his ministers of welfare, labor, and finance. But on the other hand, she's also made appointments to people that are seen as more of her people. And these are in portfolios like foreign affairs, agriculture, environment, and culture. She has pledged, she's trying to reassure international markets. She has made a pledge to try to pursue fiscal austerity and have the Mexican deficit, which is currently at 6% of GDP. And I think one open question is whether or not she would be more internationally oriented than AMLO. And her early signaling to markets is perhaps a sign there. AMLO famously was very domestic oriented, did not position Mexico to play a large role in foreign policy, but there is an opportunity for her here, especially as the president-elect of the US's largest trading partner, to take a different tact. Right now in Mexico, AMLO, who is still president for another 2 months, is handing Sheinbaum a parting gift, which is part of his that said sort of tongue-in-cheek, as part of AMLO's efforts to hollow out some of Mexico's checks and balances. AMLO has proposed a constitutional reform that would move towards having judges be elected rather than appointed. This is extremely controversial, and he's trying to have it passed through Congress before he is no longer president. And right now in Mexico, we see that judicial staff are on strike over this reform. And again, I think you can read the tea leaves either way here, right? If AMLO fully trusted Sheinbaum to carry out his vision, why push through these reforms in his lame duck period? On the other hand, she has not come out and said that she is against these reforms. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that we're asking in this seminar is whether or not democracy in Mexico is at risk. And I've talked sort of very broadly about the ways that AMLO has challenged some of the very important gains in Mexican democracy relative to checks and balances and free and fair elections. The other part of this story is political violence. These were Mexico's largest elections ever. It was not just the presidency and the Congress at stake, but the state legislatures. Mexico's a federal system, and many municipal councils and municipal governments as well. Over 20,000 posts in Mexico were elected on June 2nd, and it was also the most violent elections ever due to the incidence of organized crime in Mexican elections. A really important detail here is that organized crime in Mexico, when it engages in election violence, it's highly localized. It's specific to different states and different areas. It's usually local, not national candidates that are at risk, and it doesn't follow any particular party line. It's not the case that the cartels are in the bag for Morena or they're in the bag for the opposition. Since it's a very localized form of violence, it tends to target the politicians who are seen as serving or not serving organized crime's interest in those particular areas. So crime is a huge policy challenge for Mexico's next president. It is a huge challenge for Claudia. And one of the other sort of hot stories, this is a screenshot from the Associated Press from just 48 hours ago, is perhaps an even greater increase in crime outside of the election period. The US detained 2 cartel leaders just last month, but one challenge always has been that when you take out the leadership, you leave a sort of second tier of individuals who might choose to perpetrate violence as they fight to become the new leaders. So this is certainly a large challenge for Mexico, and election violence does impede sort of the way in which elections are free and fair above and beyond the technical capacities of the Election Institute to manage that. So next and last slide, I just want to conclude. I got a lot of with my favorite slide. If you've seen me present before, you're probably used to seeing this picture. I know it's not a screenshot of a news story like my other pictures. It is a graphic. But when I talk to reporters about Sheinbaum's election, because of this expertise in gender and politics, they would also ask me, well, what can we expect the first woman president to do, right? So there's often this narrative, and I think this is an important narrative to think about for the United States in this moment as well, that the first woman president will in particular have something different that she can bring to the table. And I call these the sort of magical unicorn narratives about women in public office, that it's perceived that because women historically have not held political power, that they will somehow be better or different. And so this often creates outsized expectations for women leaders, ability to work through some really tough problems. Organized crime in Mexico, really tough problem. Past 3 presidents, 3 different parties, 3 different approaches, none of them solved it. But one of the things we know from the Gender and Politics Scholarship is that outsized expectations often also create harder falls. And so we need to be cognizant when we're talking about women first, that just by being virtual women first does not give women president superpowers. And in fact, they may be even more constrained in some ways I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. I'm now going to invite Millen to speak on the Indian elections.
Thank you, Soleil, and thanks to the King Center, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's great to be included. It's always fun as somebody who spends a lot of time focusing on one country to think about that country in a more comparative context. So thanks for bringing us all together. The Indian election was an unusual election, I think, in many ways, because the victors ended up feeling like the defeated, and those who were defeated ended up feeling like the winners. Just to sort of recap for those who haven't been following, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, failed to secure a majority of seats in the lower house of parliament. It has formed the next government with the support of its pre-election allies known as the National Democratic Alliance, or the NDA. The BJP won around 240 seats. The alliance as a whole won 294 seats. So it comfortably exceeded the majority mark of 272. The lower house of parliament has 543 seats. The opposition alliance, which contested under this very wordy acronym of India, which stands for Indian National Developmental Inclusive Alliance, doesn't exactly roll off the tip of the tongue, won 234 seats, with its kind of central pillar, the Congress Party, emerging as the single largest opposition party with close to 100 seats, right? This was, in some sense, a real surprise. And I think this is why the BJP, although they emerged victorious, didn't quite feel that way on election day or afterwards, right? I think Modi and the BJP were expecting a resounding victory. And I think what they ended up with, which is a quite sobering victory. And I think it was a setback for at least three reasons. The first is, if you go back to the start of 2024 and look at pre-election surveys, virtually all of them predicted that the BJP would secure a third consecutive single-party majority in parliament, hands down, that it wasn't going to be a particularly close contest. And in fact, even after the elections were finished, all the votes had been cast, although they had not yet been counted. In that interim gap, a whole series of exit polls came out, which again almost uniformly showed the BJP romping with a massive majority. Elite opinion, if you were to just talk to people, and frankly, mass opinion, I think, generally held that it was the BJP's election to lose, and losing was not very likely. And then if you just heard or listened to or talked to BJP leaders, including what they were saying on the campaign, they went into these elections on a slogan of winning at least 400 seats. Which would be a supermajority in the parliament. 400 seats as part of its alliance. Now, of course, it fell far, far short of those expectations. So in some sense, we are entering, or I guess I should say maybe re-entering, a period of coalitions. Many of you might recall that India has seen this movie before between 1989 and 2014, during that quarter-century long period. India only knew coalition governments. There was no single party that was large enough to secure a parliamentary majority on its own. I would term this a partial return to coalition politics. And the reason that I say that is if you think about coalitions on a spectrum, judging them by how many seats the coalition core, this kind of single largest governing party has, this would put this current government on the stronger side. So the BJP has 240 seats out of a majority that's needed of 272. So they really only need two big allies in order to cross that majority threshold. We have seen far, far weaker much more uncertain coalition governments formed in the past. This is probably more akin to the government that was formed under the Congress Party in the early 1990s under then Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, when the Congress had around 244 seats. And of course, we remember that government for ushering in the most sweeping economic reforms in India's post-independence history, right? As I mentioned before, the BJP is really only principally beholden to two major parties, which, certainly can act as a check, but I think it's a limited check. And so this is very different from the Congress governments that we saw in power, say, between 2004 and 2014 during the Manmohan Singh prime ministership, where these governments were much, much more reliant on a bevy of regional parties to govern. Now, getting to the question of why we all were surprised, I think it's very difficult to come up with a very clever kind of narrative about these elections that kind of easily fits on a bumper sticker, one that would tell a kind of overarching national story. And I think that's because there's not a really obvious national story to tell. I think the kind of simplest narrative we can come up with is that there was a group of opposition parties that decided to lay down their arms, to contest elections together, to let bygones be bygones, in an unprecedented fashion, at least in recent memory. And that opposition consolidation forced the BJP into a more state-by-state battle in which local rather than national factors became much more important. But those local factors, so in some states it was the economy, in some states it was caste calculations, in others it was just very idiosyncratic governance grievances. Those local factors have to be seen in conjunction with the credibility of the alternative political formations in that state. And the reason that I emphasize that is because we saw very odd things take place in this election. If you think about how the BJP did in, say, a set of neighboring states, in the state of Madhya Pradesh, which has long been a bastion for the BJP, it won 100% of the seats, 29 out of 29 parliamentary seats. But just in neighboring Rajasthan, it lost nearly half of its seats, right? Suffered major losses, contrary to all expectations. If you think about India's most populous state, Uttar Pradesh, 80 seats in parliament come from this state alone. Again, the BJP suffered huge losses to the opposition coalition, but yet in neighboring Bihar, which neighbors UP to the east, it won 3/4 of all seats, right? So I think we have to be very careful and very nuanced and going, almost state by state to sort of understand these results. What are some lessons for how we might think about other elections? What if we step back and try to extrapolate from the Indian context? So one is clearly the opposition coming together. In 2014, the BJP won the first single party majority in parliament in 3 decades, in part because the opposition was very badly fragmented. And of course, hampered in part by the fact that you had a ruling Congress party, which was deeply unpopular. 5 years later, in 2019, the opposition failed really to sustain any serious level of coalition building. And so again, the BJP was able to do quite well by fragmenting the opposition vote. This time, despite the fact that they weren't able to achieve a total universal seat sharing agreement. In some of the most pivotal states, we did see the opposition decide to not contest particular seats that they believe that are rightfully theirs in order to pay deference to coalition partners, right? So that's clearly one big lesson. I think the second is, and this might sound a little bit trite, but in fact, we're seeing echoes of this in our own election in the United States, is the opposition sort of brought joy back to politics. Rahul Gandhi, the kind of, assumed leader of the Congress Party, although he's not the president of the Congress Party, went on 2 long yatras or pilgrimages by foot in which he talked about bringing love back, right? And defeating hate and connecting with the grassroots. And it was a very vague campaign. It wasn't really about policy. It actually wasn't even really about politics. But he developed this kind of image as a kind of happy warrior. even if you looked at some of the Congress parties or the opposition political ads, they sort of made you laugh out loud, right? They mocked the BJP. They were funny. They were clever. They were cutting. There were a number of memes that went viral, very similar to sort of what we're seeing with the Harris-Walz campaign right now, I think, in the United States. The third thing I'll just mention is this whole question of saving democracy. The Congress Party and the opposition 5 years ago had really gone to the ramparts talking about, the end of Indian democracy, the need to save Indian democracy. And those themes were present this time, but they were linked to more specific concrete concerns as opposed to just, the BJP representing an existential threat to democracy. And particularly, they focus on the Constitution. The BJP slogan that this time they're going to win more than 400 seats seems to have backfired because the opposition used that to go to historically disadvantaged groups to say that if the BJP gets a supermajority, 400 seats, they are going to get rid of long-standing affirmative action protections from which the poor have benefited. And this is something that if you look at the electoral map, in constituencies where Dalits, the lowest caste on the Hindu caste hierarchy, are most numerous, the BJP did quite poorly, right? So this is something where they were able to tie a larger narrative to a very specific set of actual concrete concerns. So like I said, I think a lot of these issues play differently in different states, depending on the political alternatives, and also to what extent the BJP was hampered with the tag of being the incumbent. What's interesting is that in states where the BJP was the challenger, where it hasn't historically had much of a presence, where it wasn't seen as a dominant incumbent, it did very well. So one thing to notice is that the BJP vote share at the national level didn't really change very much between 2019 and 2024. What changes the geographic composition of that vote? The BJP lost vote in some of its core areas of the Hindi heartland, as we call it. That's wide swath of kind of north central India, but gained a lot of votes in places like the South and in the East, where traditionally it's played second or third fiddle to a host of regional parties. So I don't want to go on too long. Let me just kind of end with the bottom line, and I'm sure we'll get to some of the nuances in the discussion. I think the bottom line for me is that many Indian voters have continued to back Narendra Modi or back his coalition. A significant number of voters are looking for healthy competition. So this wasn't a vote to sort of throw the rascals out, but it also wasn't necessarily a vote to say everything is fine, let's give them another 5 years, right? They felt that Modi needed a course correction, but I don't think they're necessarily fully sold on the opposition either. And let me stop there.
Thanks so much, Milan. I'm now going to invite Daniel to speak on the South African election experience.
Thank you so much, Soleil. Thank you to the King Center for having me here. And thanks, Milan and Jennifer, for your comments about India and Mexico. I just learned a lot, and I can already see a lot of parallels between what happened, especially in India, I think, and South Africa, which hopefully will draw out. By way of introduction, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about what the lay of the land in South Africa was before the election earlier this year in May, because I think South Africa is a country which many people have less political understanding of than some of the larger democracies we're discussing today. So let me start by sort of laying out the four big political players that were contesting the election in May 2024. And let me begin by saying that South Africa, unlike Mexico, but more similar to India, is a parliamentary democracy. And so these four people were really the heads of their political parties that were contesting the election. That's important just to emphasize because South Africa is a parliamentary system which confusingly elects a president. The president is really the prime minister. We just decided to use the wrong term to describe who the person is. They're also the head of state, so maybe that's why. But the incumbent president in May 2024 was Cyril Ramaphosa, who's there in the top left of your screen. the leader of the African National Congress, that's the ANC, the party that's been in power since South Africa became a multi-party democracy in 1994, the party of Nelson Mandela. Those of you will probably know that name. And so he was the incumbent, defending his first term in office since 2019 against the sitting opposition party, which is the Democratic Alliance. That's in the bottom left-hand corner. The Democratic Alliance, where the ANC is a very centrist party with a sort of left orientation economically, the Democratic Alliance is more of a center-right, sometimes a little bit further to the right than center-right party that is often understood to be a party that is preferred by many white South Africans. White South Africans are a small minority of the country, but are economic power holders, despite 30 years of post-apartheid democracy. In contrast to these two sort of central parties that for a very long time have been the two biggest players in South African politics, in the last election together they captured over 75% of the vote and 75% of the seats in parliament. We have two smaller parties, Julius Malema's Economic Freedom Fighters, that's the top right. Some of you will be familiar with him and his party. He's often called a firebrand, very strongly left, strong sort of radical left economic orientation, very interested in things like nationalizing natural resources in the country and so on and so forth. And his party won about 10% of the vote in the 2019 election. And then the bottom right, probably the most important figure in this election is Jacob Zuma, who was the president of South Africa between 2009 and 2017 as the head of the African National Congress, when he was essentially deposed by his own party in 2017. And Jacob Zuma returned to politics in this election with a big splash, essentially separating from the African National Congress and forming a new political party with an old name, Umkhonto we Sizwe, which means the spear of the nation. For those of you interested in South Africa's history, that's the name of the armed wing of the African National Congress during the struggle years against apartheid. Jacob Zuma was a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe and very deliberately took that name to try and separate himself from the ANC and to create a cleavage with the ANC. So what happened on election day, if you would click to the next slide, was what was understood by many and has been described by many as a quite radical outcome in the history of South Africa's democracy. I'll talk right at the end about how we might understand what happened and whether it was as radical as we think it was. This is just from Wikipedia and just shows the distribution of the votes by the four main parties in South Africa's parliament. Essentially what happened is that the African National Congress, which had previously won about 57% of the seats in parliament, was pulled all the way down to about 40% of the seats in parliament. And as in the case of India and the BJP, lost its majority, its ability to form a government by itself. Now, unlike the BJP, which, as Milan said, had only formed a majority in the last two elections, and there'd been a history of coalitional politics prior, there has been no history of coalitional politics in South Africa. And the African National Congress has in every election since 1994 won a clear majority of votes. So this was a huge change, a seismic shift in the structure of elite politics in South Africa, the fact that it was knocked all the way down to 40%. Notable, I think, is the fact that the Democratic Alliance didn't do any better. And the Economic Freedom Fighters also didn't do any better, but Jacob Zuma's new party, Umkhonto we Sizwe, did extremely well, winning 15% of the vote out of nothing, essentially stealing almost all of the votes that the ANC happened to lose. One of the things that's not reflected here, unless you know a lot about South African politics, is that turnout in the election was also severely depressed. So turnout among registered voters in South Africa in 2019 was around 67% of all registered voters, which is already very low, given that not everybody's registered. It's less than 50% of all voting age population. That decreased to 57%. In other words, to almost 40% of voting age population turning out to vote. That's extremely low turnout, and I'll say a little bit more about it right at the end. Could we go to the next slide? To sort of discuss some of the beats, I think, that come out of the election. The first is that South Africa now has coalitional government. It's, as I said, something that they've never had before. So about 2 weeks after the election, if you look at the left-hand figure, Cyril Ramaphosa announced that he and the Democratic Alliance had formed what they call a government of national unity, which is just a throwback to 1994. It's just a coalition. But this is really important. They managed to, these two sort of centrist parties, or somewhat centrist parties, managed to come together and form a coherent governing coalition. And what's been quite surprising, I think, to many is that after 2 months of coalitional government, or 6 weeks of coalitional government, things have gone quite well. People anticipated that this would be very difficult, that people wouldn't get along, that there were going to be a lot of cleavages that would cause a lot of problems. And in the last 6 weeks, at least, it seems that the government of national unity has actually done a lot and sort of is quite stable, which people at the Financial Times think is a really good thing for investors. Next slide, please. But just to draw out sort of two other beats from the election that I think are important and relate to the American election as that we're anticipating in the next few months. The first is, and this is an academic and a colleague from UCT, the University of Cape Town, who was posting this as the election results were coming out. The first is a worrying trend some people have perceived around the rise of ethno-nationalist politics in South Africa. In other words, Josh here is concerned about the fact that a number of political parties in South Africa are no longer thinking about the nation in the way that the African National Congress does, but instead of thinking about more narrow segments of the population. So, for example, Umkhonto we Sizwe is heavily focused on Zulu nationalism in the province of KwaZulu-Natal in southern Mpumalanga. And there's a concern there that that's a harbinger of a rise of ethno-nationalist politics, a reflection of what we've seen all over the world in the last 10, 15 years as democracy has come increasingly under threat. There's other examples of that too in the case of South Africa, the rise of a couple of parties focused on colored identity, colored community being the community largely in the Western Cape and the Northern Cape of mixed race people who have sort of formed their own ethnic identity over the last 200 years, and under apartheid were given their own unique designation of colored. That's one reasonable perspective, I think, and it's something to be aware of and something to worry about. At the same time, I think these underlying currents have always been there in South African politics. Jacob Zuma was part of the reason he rose to power in the ANC in the first place, was his ability to unite a disparate ethnic group in the voters of KwaZulu-Natal. And that was part of the reason he was elevated in 2007 in the first place. So while I think there's some reality here, we should also bear in mind that these politics have existed for a very long time, and that the vast majority of South African voters largely didn't vote for sort of extremist or narrow ethno-racial parties. If you go to the next slide, the second sort of beat that I think echoes what's happening in the United States is that Jacob Zuma, after the election, quite literally pulled a card out of Donald Trump's playbook and attempted to relitigate the election and ask the Independent Electoral Commission to rerun the election because they said that there was vote rigging. They essentially made a whole bunch of unsubstantiated claims, tried a few legal avenues to argue that the election was fraudulent, and demanded a recount, and that was shut down very quickly. And I think the lesson there for the United States is that election administration matters. And this is something that maybe we don't pay enough attention to as political scientists or as social scientists. But the actual governance of elections helps to shape the quality of the response that we can make to people like Jacob Zuma or Donald Trump when they make claims that are not based in fact in an attempt to relitigate an election. And essentially what happened here was that every single political party was on board with the Independent Electoral Commission, which is known to be nonpartisan and independent and high quality. And the courts were able to essentially quash any attempts by MK to relitigate the election extremely quickly. One of the big benefits of a place like South Africa is that election results come out extremely fast. So about 48 hours after the election was finished, we knew precisely pretty much where the votes had been cast and who was going to win the election. Obviously, in the United States, things are much slower, and that slowness, I think, creates an opportunity for misbehavior. And then to the last slide, please. So just to sort of draw things together, I think there's a strong narrative that what happened in South Africa in May is a sea change, essentially that South Africa has changed forever, that the ANC was voted out of office by people who didn't like what they had achieved over the last 30 years. I think it's worth mentioning a few things. The first is that, as in the case of India, the ANC won the election. They just didn't win the election by as much as they had previously won the election. The second thing to remember, I think, is that most voters in South Africa essentially voted for the exact same people that they voted for in 2019. Many of them also left the electorate, seemingly. But essentially, the point being, there wasn't a big shift in the way voters perceive the different parties. It wasn't that voters looked at the ANC's record and said, oh no, we want to try something different. We want to vote with an opposition party. It's rather that there was a split within the main party and voters simply followed the elites they preferred best. The way I've framed this before is that everything has changed in South African politics since May 29th, but on the ground, really nothing is different in terms of the way voters are behaving. Voters are simply picking their preferred elites. And finally, after 30 years, the elites have split up and formed different political parties. But that's not to say that this election isn't a watershed and isn't important. And I think coalitional politics is for sure going to change the shape of South African politics in the foreseeable future. And it's hard to imagine a return to a situation in which we no longer have coalitional politics. The final thing that I'll mention is just in terms of turnout, as I said, was that this election had this depressingly low turnout among voters. And South Africa has for a very long time battled with a very specific problem that the United States has as well, which is incredibly low turnout among young people. In fact, South Africa, I think, probably has the most severe case of this I've found in a modern democracy, where people, especially those under the sort of age at which they would have experienced life under apartheid, drop off almost cataclysmically in terms of turnout. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is that over time, those generational shifts mean that more and more of the electorate becomes the post-apartheid electorate. And so the politics of apartheid South Africa no longer represent their interests or anything that they can attach themselves to. And that suggests perhaps that there's a big opportunity for a political party or political movement that activates those young voters and finds a way to communicate with them and make them feel as if their interests are being paid attention to. Much in the same way, I think that the Democratic Party is struggling to do exactly that with voters in the United States. Unfortunately, as we all know, young people are extremely hard to get out to the polls, and so it's hard to base an entire electoral strategy around them. I'll leave it there and I'll hand back to you, Soleil, so I don't take any more time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Daniel. And thanks to all three of the panelists for fantastic presentations. So given we have only a limited amount of time left, what I'm going to do is I've been reading all the questions you all have posted. I'm not going to ask them directly. What I'm going to do is I'm going to try to combine them into single questions that can be answered just so we can address as many as possible. And I'm going to ask the panelists to give just short 1 to 2 minute responses so we can get through a couple of questions in the rest of time. I think how, the fact that there are both so many questions and so much to say is evidence of just how much there is to learn from these elections. But to start us off, I want to pick up where Daniel just left us off, which is we know that a big question in the upcoming election regards turnout. And we know that turnout has been really important in the recent US elections. I wonder if you all can speak a little bit about what turnout looked like in these elections. What got people to turn out? Were people motivated by economic issues, social issues, identity, foreign policy? And what does all of this say about demand for democracy from below? And don't feel you have to tackle all of those questions, but just whatever you think is relevant from your context. Would anyone like to jump in?
I'm happy to jump in, Soleil.
Great, thanks, Milan.
So turnout ended up being kind of a popular motif around these elections. As many of you might know, Indian elections, there's no single voting day. The country is broken up into multiple phases, and a section of the country votes in each phase. This time around, there were 7 phases spread out over 6 weeks. And there were early reports from some of the initial phases that turnout was significantly lower than turnout had been in 2019 and in 2014. In the end, actually, turnout wasn't as low as we thought. In 2014, India experienced its highest voter turnout ever in a national election at 66.5% of the electorate. In 2019, that number actually grew by a percentage point. And 2024 was almost 66%. So, not that different from the past two elections. It would still be the third most participatory election if you were to kind of look at it in historical terms. But I do think there was something very interesting that took place, and this is really where Soleil is the expert, is we've seen a real shift in the composition of the electorate. Specifically in gender terms. If you go back and look at the earliest general elections, in fact, general elections over the first several decades after independence, there was always a significant gender gap in voter turnout. Male turnout was higher than female turnout by an order of 8 to 12 percentage points. And in this election, actually following a trend of the last two, basically it was even. Male turnout is now the same as female turnout. In most state elections, it is now the default case that female turnout is greater than male turnout, right? So I think that's a pretty significant shift. I think it's influenced how parties have campaigned. I think it's influenced the way that they've crafted their platforms, and it's even affected, I think, legislation. So we saw just before these elections, the BJP pass a long-standing or long-pending bill to reserve 1/3 of state assembly and national parliamentary seats for women. Now, that change isn't going to go in effect for some time, but it was quite a big deal to a lot of people that they managed to actually push through this legislation. We haven't seen those changes necessarily reflect on female candidates that are given party tickets or women who end up as winners. Those numbers are still really low, but I do think there's an idea now that women represent a really crucial part of the electorate in a way that we haven't fully seen in years past.
I think turnout in Mexico is a complicated story. Turnout in this election was just over 60%, which it's been in the past few elections. So there was not big swings in turnout. And I think it's complicated because of the way in which in certain districts, in certain states, the threat of violence and the way organized crime, but also some political parties might use the threat of violence on election day to depress turnout. I think that is part of the story, but again, we don't have a clear story because we can't say that it is clearly at the national level, right, favoring one party or the other, because these violent dynamics are highly localized. I do think there's some lessons for the US, right? It was never perceived at the presidential level in Mexico to be a particularly close race. People expected Morena to win, right? And I think we see from the congressional results that who turned out were supporters for Morena. We know as political scientists, right, that when elections are thought to be a foregone conclusion, turnout dips, right? Because your individual voter doesn't think that their vote matters. That's why the Obamas and the DNC last night tried to tell everyone, yes, Milan, we're bringing the party back, but it's still going to be a close election and turnout will really matter for the Democrats. I think the other challenge in the Mexican case was, the opposition did not have a clear story about who they were or what they offered beyond that they were not Morena, right? The part of it was that you had traditional parties of the left, right, and center who maybe didn't agree on what they would offer, right? Other than being not Morena. But I think that perhaps could have affected, right, the opposition's ability to persuade their supporters to turn out, right? Because you might have turned out if you were also staunchly not Morena. I know plenty of not Morenistas who would have, voted for a golden retriever instead of AMLO. But I think there were probably a segment of Mexicans that wanted to know what the clear alternative to Morena was. And I don't think that the opposition, as much as Xochitl Galvez was personally a charismatic candidate, right, and was personally a talented candidate, I don't think that the opposition as a whole, gave voters a clear answer, and that might also have been part of the story of who stayed home.
I'll just add one thing, because I already spoke a little bit about turnout in the South African case. I think as someone who in my professional work studies turnout, I think one of the kind of mysterious things about turnout is that in some ways it's an extremely overdetermined political act. There just aren't that many marginal turnout people in the world. There's just not that many people who are kind of on a knife edge about whether they're going to vote or not. Those people do exist, but there's just not that many of them. And so invariably, I think in a lot of elections, you do see these small changes in turnout, as I think what seems to be both the case in Mexico and India, and in the US largely, right? We don't really see these enormous shifts in turnout. And so that does, I think, raise interesting questions about, like, for example, the South African case, where we saw this huge downward shift in turnout, especially given, as Jennifer said, this was an election where everybody thought it was going to be close, and yet everybody kind of stayed home anyway. And to me, that kind of speaks to the importance of just remembering that turnout is so overdetermined. That a lot of what's happening, I think, here is just generational turnover and sort of big stuff that's shifting people's relationship to politics over time, rather than sort of small things that we can activate on election day. And I do suspect, in the United States, we've had 8 years now of this sort of gerontocracy of politics kind of take hold. And you've got to wonder about sort of what that's going to do generationally to US voters over time. And as much as I sort of, I'm a big fan of the sort of Harris-Walz efforts to use memery to kind of get young people involved in politics, you've got to imagine that it's more than just sort of a single campaign can do. You've got to kind of fundamentally shift the way in which generations relate to politics. But I'm probably speaking beyond the data at this point.
So with our last few minutes, I'm just going to ask you all a last question, and feel free to use it to give whatever final thoughts you want to share to the audience. But summarizing what I've heard in some way from each of you, there's been concern about democratic backsliding in each of these countries in past years, but the recent elections have also brought narratives of optimism. However, my conclusion from each of you is actually that there is some reason for pause and belief that democracy may still be at risk. And so we should interpret that optimism with caution. Could I just ask each of you to conclude by speaking a bit more about what you think the biggest risks to democracy are and what could be done by citizens or elites to counter these risks?
I mean, I think I'll just jump in. I think in my answers, I've sort of alluded to two for Mexico, right? I do think the crime and security situation is a massive risk for democracy. I think I have stressed its local dynamic, but I don't want that to sound minimizing. This was the election with the highest number of candidates or other political actors to be targeted with physical assault, harassment, threats, and even assassinations by organized crime. So I'm emphasizing its local dynamic because I don't want anyone to exit this conversation thinking that it's working for one political side or the other, but not because it's not very serious. And I think that when it is affecting who puts themselves forward as candidates, who drops out early in the race for candidates, and then affecting turnout, I think that's really serious. I think at the elite level in Mexico, there is certainly a challenge with AMLO and perhaps Sheinbaum's orientation towards protecting or eroding institutional checks and balances related to the judiciary, and then also external checks and balances related to, say, election administration. But I want to stress, because I saw this in the comments, and I think this will be my last set of comments, Mexico is not at this moment Venezuela, right? AMLO is a populist. He's a left populist. I've written extensively about that. There's many ways in which he's populist, also in terms of his style, his discourse, on and on. But we are not seeing at this moment, right, from Mexican leaders, the kind of authoritarian tactics that we are seeing in other countries, right? It is still possible to exercise dissent in Mexico. You are not beat up by security forces or killed by security forces, right? There is dissent. There are mobilizations in response to that dissent. So it's not yet the case that AMLO is rounding up. Now, he's dismissive of his critics. He's not nice to them, but he's not rounding them up, jailing them, hounding them out of the country. So I think we have to be careful at conflating authoritarianism on the left with populism on the left. There's a Venn diagram there, but these are not the same contexts.
Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone else have any final thoughts?
Go for it.
Yeah, sure. I think, Soleil, there have been probably three big critiques of Indian democracy over the past decade. The one is an excessive concentration of power in the hands of the executive, namely the Prime Minister's office, a rising intolerance of dissent and kind of contrary narratives to the government line. And the third is a sort of rising tide of Hindu nationalism or Hindu fundamentalism. I think when you think about the trends or what this election says about those three, I would urge some caution. I think when it comes to the concentration of power, it is true that you now have the executive has slightly less power. The prime minister has slightly less power. He has to govern with coalition allies, which is something that he's never had to do, not in 10 years as prime minister or 13 years as chief minister of the state of Gujarat. But it is a limited check, as I mentioned above, just because the reliance on only two parties, and two parties that are regional parties, which are much more concerned about developments in their state and parochial issues having to do with their state than necessarily with nationwide issues. When it comes to dissent, I think it's important to point out that the tools that the ruling party has used to clamp down on alternate voices or contrary voices, these are tools that it inherited. And these are tools that the others, including the Congress Party, had used and abused before. And if one just takes a peek down at the state level and moves away from New Delhi, you will see that many of these tools are being used by BJP governments, by Congress governments, by regional party governments. Now, one could make the case that the BJP at the center has used them more ruthlessly. It's used them more effectively. It's used them less opportunistically and more purposefully. But I do think that there's a general culture of impunity when it comes to this kind of intolerance. And the last thing on Hindu nationalism, I think it is true that it may be hard now for the BJP to legislate Hindu nationalist objectives through the parliament because it doesn't have the ability to ram things through so easily. But, a lot of the Hindu nationalist agenda takes place in disparate ways. It happens through state measures, through local measures, through a lot of informal actions, right? So if we think about cow vigilantism, or love jihad, this trope about Muslim men trying to seduce Hindu women in an effort to convert them, right? These are all things that are happening through civil society, through parts of the BJP broader ecosystem, but not because any new laws were passed, right? And I think those things I do expect are going to continue, irrespective of who's in power in Delhi or how powerful they are.
Thanks, Milan. Dan,
Do I have a chance to say anything more, or?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So I think just trying to draw out some lessons for the US and for the world, I think, from the South African case, given that in some ways Jacob Zuma's presidency from 2009 to 2017 was very similar in character, I think, to Donald Trump's rise in presidency 2016 to 2020, is maybe just sort of thinking about how a lot of these challenges to democracy are in some ways the rolls of the dice, where there's kind of there's sort of three pieces of each puzzle. One is the individual, the second is the party, and the third is the institutions, all kind of brought together in terms of context and what sort of political context, what opportunities political context creates. And that in South Africa, I think in some ways we're extremely lucky that we have so far, I think, dodged a lot of these sort of anti-democratic bullets and have ended up, I think, in quite a remarkably democratic outcome in 2024. And it's partly because we've just gotten a little bit lucky. We had a strong man, Jacob Zuma, rise to power, but the political party, the ANC, was strong enough in 2017 to turf him out. And they turfed him out because they understood, I think, in 2017 that he was doing severe damage to the party's electoral possibilities in 2019 and beyond. And that, I think, is a lesson for the US and for the Republican Party, and the fact that the Republican Party has not yet found a mechanism, a means, or a way to get rid of Donald Trump. And partly, I think it's because of the structure of the party. The ANC is very private. It doesn't do open primaries. It doesn't sort of have this, extremely open way of existing. It's a very private, very closed organization. So they have the power to do that. But then also just in terms of thinking about institutions, that South Africa, again, has gotten very lucky in that it has a very well-established legal system and judicial system that has managed to somehow, and it's a bit of a mystery how, but it's managed to somehow sort of remain as a bulwark against 30 years of single-party rule, where the ANC has had to defer many times to the court, even though it doesn't necessarily need to. The ANC could easily have just sort of told the Constitutional Court of South Africa, which is our version of the Supreme Court, to stuff it and go and sit on Constitutional Hill and do its own thing, but it hasn't. It's broadly been forced somehow, and it's a bit of a mystery to me still how, to follow. But that does suggest, I think, the importance of independent institutions and the sustenance of those independent institutions. And it raises, I think, a lot of red flags when you think about the status of the Supreme Court and the status, in many ways, of both houses of Congress in the US and their ability to stand up to individuals in the presidency. So I'll leave it there. But I think hopefully there's something pretty common, I think, in a lot of these cases.
Well, I know we're past time, so I'm going to have to conclude us, but I have to say there's so much more that we could all say on this that I'm sure you all could say, and many questions left unanswered, which I think speaks to the real importance of all of this. I want to close by just saying a deep felt gratitude and thank you to Daniel, Jennifer, and Millen for sharing your insights with us today. I can certainly say that I have learned a huge amount from this panel, and so I'm really grateful to benefit from your expertise. And to everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining us. We really look forward to seeing you at future King Center events, and you'll find some information on the slide here. Thanks to everyone.